Welcome to MetaPod, the podcast where we discuss operational execs and organizations that make and move stuff, and our common headaches, digital transformation, the forever labor shortage, and doing more with less. And now, the host of MetaPod, Ron Crabtree.
Welcome back, Meta friends, as we continue to discuss the tariff tsunami and how to more easily navigate our new trade policies. For this episode, we're discussing how modeling the supply chain and costs can provide the direction and best practices to generate substantial savings. Today, we're shedding light on how you too can benefit from technology called the digital twin. I have Greg Smith with me today, as he's a meta expert with us. And Greg, could you share with our audience just a little bit about yourself and why you're speaking about this technology today?
Certainly, Kim, and thank you for inviting me. I guess my introduction is I've been in the supply chain consulting space for over 25 years. I've been working with consumer packaged goods, life sciences, pharmaceutical companies, and I found that their reliance on foreign operations for sourcing of raw goods, for packaged goods, and for other products has been very heavily dependent. So these recent tariffs have hit them very hard. And again, I think we saw that the Trump administration imposed some very significant tariffs on China. And everybody was trying to scramble to figure out what that meant to them. But then a couple weeks or so afterwards, they showed a relaxation of those tariffs on China. But interestingly enough, if you read deeper into the proposal, those tariffs were not relaxed on three areas: pharmaceuticals, automobiles, and steel. So as much as the U.S. market is still heavily dependent on China for raw goods that make up our pharmaceuticals, packaged goods, and finished supply chain pharmaceuticals, those tariffs are still in place. In fact, the Commerce Secretary recently came out and said that they're not going to relax those pharmaceutical tariffs because that's a threat to our country. So we're drawing a very hard line in the ground here, or a hard line in the sand, saying, look, it's an imperative that this country maintain its stability in the life sciences space and that we keep that going forward. Interestingly enough, the Trump administration also came out recently with a mandate that the prices of drugs must be relaxed significantly, reduced. So in effect, what they're saying is this is going to put U.S. costs of pharmaceuticals on par with the rest of the country, the rest of the world. So all of these are imposing huge effects on U.S.-based pharmaceutical companies. And again, if you look at cutting costs, the most effective way to cut cost is by improving your supply chain.
Right.
So what we're finding is that companies are starting to pay attention to their supply chains again. We saw this during COVID. When COVID hit, we found how incredibly reactive our supply chains are, not proactive. We found out how vulnerable they were to these disruptions. We kind of got away from that a little bit after COVID was over. Now we have tariffs, and once again, we're looking at the same reactive supply chain versus proactive supply chains. Where I'm going with this is, it comes down to being able to model and to be able to do risk-based assessments. And to do that, you have to have a complete view of your supply chain.
So could you describe the type of situations a company might experience that would prompt them to want to do this type of modeling?
Sure. Again, I'll use the analysis or the analogy of China. Sourcing a lot of our raw goods, and I say we, I'm talking about the pharmaceutical industry, life sciences, medical device. We're sourcing a lot of our raw goods that go into the manufacture of these products out of China. We were also manufacturing a lot of these products in China. Now, the costs are going to be significantly higher because of these tariffs. So companies are starting to look at their different scenarios. Do I offshore, onshore, nearshore? Do I use a manufacturing facility? Do I use a contract manufacturer? And again, they're not prepared to be making these risk-based assessments. So we're again looking at our supply chains and saying, instead of just being operational on a day-to-day basis, we need to be looking at this on a global basis and being able to do this risk-based assessment.
Great. Makes a lot of sense. So could you share with the audience like 3 to 5 steps an organization should consider before going down the path of choosing a modeling tool, let's say?
Well, I would say that this is something I've been preaching for 25 years, that again, organizations, supply chains are very disparate. In effect, sales and operations planning doesn't talk to transportation management, doesn't talk to production planning. So you've got all these different components within the supply chain, but they're not cohesive. They're not working together. So if procurement makes a decision, it's independent of sales and operations planning. So sales may be going out and saying, look, we're going to be producing we're going to be having sales of X number of widgets this quarter. That's not necessarily being transmitted to procurement, or it's not being transported to manufacturing. So it's kind of an unharmonious process. And I've been preaching to clients for a long time, we need to standardize that process. And one final point on that, we kind of grew up as supply chains became very technologically savvy. Transportation management might have bought a software program. Production planning might have bought a software program. We've got ERP systems. But again, not to be redundant, but they don't talk to each other. So this data is kind of floating around out there. And I have to also mention that if you get into an organization and start looking at the supply chain, one of the things you'll find is a lot of the operational decisions that are being made on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis are still being done on Excel spreadsheets. Now, as fancy as our systems are and as fancy as our technologies are, the day-to-day operations are still on Excel spreadsheets. So one of the things that we're preaching to clients, and clients are finally coming around to the fact that we need to aggregate all of that data into a central repository.
Okay.
And that way we can start making informed decisions and doing the modeling that you just talked about, the digital twin.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about this digital twin and why do you use that and why did how is it different than anything else?
Well, I think the digital twin is, in effect, it's taking this aggregated data and it's being able to, it gives senior management, supply chain leaders, the ability to do risk-based modeling without affecting their supply chain. So it's basically a mirror image of your current state supply chain, but it gives you the opportunity to work with that and make decisions or make informed processes. What if I change my procurement process from being China-based to moving it to importing products from, say, Africa? What's the cost benefit going to be? Is there a cost benefit? What are the risks associated with that? If you want to look at onshore, offshore modeling of manufacturing, what are my costs of onshore, offshore, nearshore modeling of my supply chain?
So what type of risks would a modeling tool like this reveal to an organization? What might it show?
Well, I think what it'll do, let's look at procurement. A lot of procurement departments really haven't been analyzed recently. So one of the things that I find when I go in and work with a client, and I'm working with a client right now, interestingly enough, where I was brought in to look at their procurement department. And one of the things I found is there was huge risk because they were very heavily dependent on 2 or 3 suppliers.
Okay.
So they hadn't analyzed their supplier base. when we got in and started analyzing the supplier base, we found out that their current suppliers were not always supplying the right product.
Wow.
Or they weren't supplying in a timely fashion.
Okay.
And again, I go back to, I don't want to be redundant here, but I go back to the process. Then procurement wasn't informing production of that. So production was moving ahead, but the raw goods and the material to go into production weren't necessarily in stock.
Well, that's pretty serious.
That's the type of risk that you can use the digital twin to start modeling, saying, wait a minute, the vendors that we're currently reliant on for production have been wrong 60% of the time, or the product they've supplied has been not up to speed. So we need to start looking at different vendors. And again, that's very hard when you're in the production planning group or when you're in the procurement group. You're solely focused on your day-to-day activities and you're not looking at the big picture.
So, what are some of the things that can go wrong and need to be anticipated when you're using tools?
Well, I think that the biggest problem that most companies have, and I alluded to it earlier, is this disaggregated data. The fact that the data is spread out throughout the organization. And it's not just on the supply chain side, but you also have finance, you have HR involved because you're having to look at production planning. You're going to have to ramp up if you decide to onshore your product, the production of your product. You're going to have to hire people. So all of these functions need to be integrated. And I think the biggest problem right now is you've got all this disparate data floating around out there without a central repository. And that puts companies at risk. So again, back to the digital twin, where if you do this, you can not only find out what data you're missing or where your data is disaggregated, but you can also start looking at how to bring that data into a central repository and start doing the analytic tools that we talked about. If I reshore my manufacturing, what does that mean to HR? How much do we need to hire? What does that mean for procurement? What does it mean for logistics? All of these different scenarios have to be played out. And again, senior management can then make an informed decision on which is the best possible scenario.
Right. So, is there anything else they should consider that sometimes they miss?
I think too many organizations are heavily dependent on lower cost of production. And I think that's why we saw a huge flight to China and India, because China and India can basically produce a product for less than a third of what it costs to do here. I won't go into, why they can do that and their labor laws. But again, looking at those scenario planning, what is the cost going to be if we bring it stateside? And what if we do a nearshore, offshore model for manufacturing?
Mhm.
Those are the kind of things I think we need to look at. And that's what I think organizations are finally coming home to. I think tariffs have forced everybody to focus on that.
Yeah. So maybe that's a good thing. That
I think it is a good thing. And again, I think
it's a little better, smarter.
well, I also think it's forcing organizations to look at their models and look at their supply chains as, okay, we understand that we have a job to do in our supply chain, which is to functionally operate. But we also need to start thinking beyond that and start thinking more proactively versus reactively. And that's where the digital twins come in.
Cool. So, often we learn the most from failure, right? Can you think of an example where there may have been some failure that could have been avoided, either if they've used a digital twin or, you know, just what could you share in that line?
Well, I have a client that I was working with, interestingly enough, that we were working with them on their project management office for supply chain. When we were looking at it, analyzing it, and bringing it up to speed, then the tariffs hit. And so we kind of pivoted the engagement away from the project management office over to tariffs. And we found out that this particular, it's a division of a Fortune 500 pharmaceutical company. I can't tell you who it is, but
Of
it's
course, yeah.
very dependent on raw goods and the cost of raw goods. And what we found out when we started doing this modeling is that their procurement was woefully inadequate and that what they were getting from their suppliers was subpar. That affected their entire organization, and it affected how much, again, something that you and I would consider simple. How much do we need to keep on hand to meet our production goals? How many, what raw goods do we need to keep in stock? They weren't even doing that. Everything was being done back of the napkin. So had we these digital twins, we could have looked at that as a potential risk. And again, maybe called that out a month or two, 3 months, 4 months in advance, saying, "Hey, we've got a serious problem here."
Right. Excellent. Thanks so much for sharing that. And that brings us pretty much to a conclusion of the questions I had for you. And I just want to say thank you for your time today. Your insights were just incredibly valuable, and I'm very confident our audience will greatly benefit from them.
Well, if I can just throw in one option,
Yep.
a lot of people are looking at digital twins now, but they're not looking at the totality of it. It's kind of a buzzword and a cool thing to do.
Oh, okay.
But if you're not looking at the totality of your data, if you're not aggregating that data and mapping that data first, this whole exercise is going to be fruitless.
Oh, very good point. Thank you for bringing that up. I really appreciate that. And I'm sure others will too. So, digital twin, there's a lot of different types of digital twins or different softwares that fill that role. Is that what you're sharing?
Well, there are different scenario planners that you can use, but again, a lot of them are fractional in that they may be very good at production planning, or they may be very good at procurement, or they may be very good at, logistics. So what companies need to do is once they've done that mapping of data, you understand and bringing that data into a central repository, that they choose a tool that looks at the entire supply chain, not just a piece of the supply chain.
Okay.
So if you say use your ERP vendor, that may look at finance. Or if you look at your warehouse management solution, it's going to look at the warehouse management scenarios, and it's not going to look at the big picture. And this is what we're trying to get clients to realize is they need to stop being fractionalized and take all of this data into models that show the entirety of the supply chain and how each piece of the supply chain is affected by the other.
Excellent. You bring in so many good points, Greg, and I want to share with our audience that if they'd like to talk with you and have you help them with their situation, you can reach Greg through the metaexperts.com site and just do either, contact us, or you can actually log right in and look at Greg's profile.
Well, if I might, one last point. During this process and throughout my 25 years of doing supply chain consulting, I've put together a best practices playbook.
Oh, okay.
It's a proprietary best practices playbook that also is an engagement model. So it's not, let's start something from ground zero. We have very process-oriented delivery models that we can benchmark against other industry standards, which typically makes these engagements and the payback on these engagements much faster.
Right. What would you say is an average ROI a company might experience?
I've seen anything from as low as 20% to sometimes as much as 70 or 80%.
Okay.
But it's not necessarily an ROI, but it's also the risk base.
Yes, that's right.
So it's looking at what if scenarios. And if you can predetermine what those risk areas are, how do you measure that ROI?
Yeah, that you can't measure.
Right.
You can only measure it after the fact, right?
Well, and the shareholders are typically, looking at that going, why didn't you think about this ahead of time?
That's right.
So how do you measure that?
Yeah. very difficult, but
But again, that's where we go back to using this best practices database. My proprietary best practices database gives you those thought processes and helps you understand where you need to begin the process of creating your digital twin.
so I would say you've done the thinking for an organization because, or in my world, I often say it's much easier to edit than it is to create. So you've given them the creative, and all they have to do is come in and edit it to match their organization.
Well, and I like to think that I work hand in hand with my clients to do that. I'm not one of the elite, high-end, I won't name any of the names, consulting firms that do, that come in their Armani suits and publish pretty PowerPoint presentations. I like to think I'm more boots on the ground and get in and finally realize it. And again, this is where once you get on the ground and start working with clients, you find out that Excel spreadsheets are still the predominant solution provider in supply chain.
Awesome. So, any last words you'd like to share before we close today?
I think my last words, this is not something that should be thought about. This is something that needs to happen. If COVID didn't show us how easily disrupted our supply chains are, now we've got the tariffs that are doing the same thing. And again, we're getting caught flat-footed, and I say supply chains are getting caught flat-footed in that they're very reactive versus proactive. We've got to move supply chains to that proactive model, doing the risk assessments, doing the one-off scenarios, and bringing all of the supply chain functions under one roof. And the easiest way to do that is through data and the centralization of data. Because once you have that central repository of data, now you can start doing very proactive thinking.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And I so appreciate your time. This was excellent.
It's really my pleasure. And we got lucky. The Blue Angels didn't fly over and disrupt our call.
That's right, they didn't. So now you have to share this story. So
I'm based in Annapolis, Maryland, and this is graduation week. It's commissioning week for the Naval Academy. And because of that, they usually bring in the Blue Angels who do some very impressive flyovers. And the good news is it's fun to watch. The bad news is they go right over the top of my house. And when you're on a conference call, it can be a little bit disruptive, but thankfully they didn't come over while we were speaking today.
awesome. Well, thanks for that story. And
My pleasure.
here, have a wonderful day.
Enjoy your day, and thank you very much for talking with me.
Thank you. Bye.
Be well.
Thank you for joining MetaPod. For requests on topics or to ask questions, you can connect with Ron Crabtree 3 ways: via email at metapod@metaexperts.com, via LinkedIn, or by calling him directly at 734-425-1455, extension 103. Lastly, if you love the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review on your favorite podcast app. We truly appreciate all your support.